In this special edition of the Cameron Journal podcast, I wanted to go through this article and this narrative in a more extended format than we would normally do during the news hour or doing something else. Longtime listeners of the podcast will know that usually every year I do a series of produced and pre-recorded episodes where I talk about a series of topics, and it's just me, no guests, no interview, and I just go through things. And so this is kind of one of those self-similar episodes where we're going to do something like that. I had this article called "The Case for Colonialism." I had it sitting in my video ideas for a while. Took a while to get to it, which is always fun and exciting. And let's start at the beginning and let me tell you how this started. So how this started was I consume a lot of Twitter. It's part of how I prep for the show, everything else. And so I was reading through Twitter last night and people were talking about, colonialism and why it can be good and why, some people are better than others based upon immutable characteristics like race and IQ and all this sort of thing. And that stuff has never brooked much truck with me. But when someone posted this, I remember reading through it and I was kind of like, well, there's some interesting ideas in here. And so a lot of the times, especially those of us on the left, we're always talking about, decolonizing stuff, and we talk about the evils and how terrible colonialism was, and how it's been a scourge on the planet and all this sort of thing. And even though it might seem a little ridiculous, and in some cases I think be a little ridiculous, I think it's worth talking about this, and especially this article was very controversial. Reading from the article, there's an editor's note that this is from the National Association of Scholars. The editor's note from June 6th of 2021 says NAS member Bruce Gilley's article, "The Case for Colonialism," went through double-blind peer review and was published in Third World Quarterly in 2017. It provoked enormous controversy and generated two separate petitions signed by thousands of academics demanding that it be retracted, that TWQ apologize, and that the editor or editors responsible for its publication be dismissed. 15 members of the journal's 34-member editorial board also resigned in protest. Publisher Taylor and Francis issued a detailed explanation of the peer review process that the article had undergone, countering accusations of, quote, poorly executed pseudo-scholarship, unquote. But serious threats of violence against the editor led the journal to withdraw the article, both in print and online. Gilley was also personally and professionally attacked and received death threats. On the good side, many rallied to his defense, including Noam Chomsky, and many supported the general argument of the article. We publish it below in its entirely conformed to U.S. English and our style. You may read Professor Gilley's "The Case for Colonialism," a response to my critics here. And we might have to go check that out. We'll see. But obviously we don't have time necessarily to read the whole thing, but I want to go over some, because it's long. I'm scrolling through it now if you don't have the visuals. It's long. There's a lot to it, but I do want to go through some of the major points, and some of what I kind of look at as chief ideas in the article. So we're going to start out by reading the introduction to give ourselves a basis for kind of what this is about. And it begins as follows. For the last 100 years, Western colonialism has had a bad name. Colonialism has virtually disappeared from international affairs, and there is no easier way to discredit a political idea or opponent than to raise the cry of colonialism. When South African opposition politician Helen Zille tweeted in 2017 that Singapore's success was in part attributable to its ability to, quote, build on valuable aspects of colonial heritage, unquote, she was vilified by the press, disciplined by her party, and put under investigation by the country's Human Rights Commission. It is high time to reevaluate this pejorative meaning. The notion that colonialism is always and everywhere is a bad thing needs to be rethought in light of the grave human toll of a century of anti-colonial regimes and policies. The case for Western colonialism is about rethinking the past as well as improving the future. It involves reaffirming the primacy of human lives, universal values, and shared responsibilities. The civilizing mission without scare quotes. That led to improvements in living conditions for most third world peoples during most episodes of Western colonialism. It also involves learning how to unlock those benefits again. Western and non-Western countries should reclaim the colonial toolkit and language as part of their commitment to effective governance and international order. There are 3 ways to reclaim colonialism. One is for governments and peoples in developing countries to replicate as far as possible the colonial governance of their past, as successful countries like Singapore, Belize, and Botswana did. The, quote, good governance agenda, unquote, which contains too many assumptions about the self-governing capacity of poor countries, should be replaced with the colonial governance agenda. A second way is to recolonize some regions. Western countries should be encouraged to hold power in specific governance areas, public finances, say, or criminal justice, in order to jumpstart enduring reforms in weak states. Rather than speak in euphemisms about shared sovereignty or neo-trusteeship, such action should be called colonialism, because it would embrace rather than evade the historical record. Thirdly, in some instances, it may be possible to build new Western colonies from scratch. Colonialism can return either as a governance style or as an extension of Western authority, only with the consent of the colonized. Yet now that the nationalist generation has forced sudden decolonization on hapless populations has passed away, the time may be ripe. Sebe has documented how the founding figures of Western colonialism in Africa, such as Livingstone in Zambia, Lugard in Nigeria, and De Brazza in Congo, are enjoying a resurgence of official and social respect in those countries now that the romanticized pre-colonial and disappointing post-colonial approaches to governance have lost their sheen. As one young man in the streets of Kinshasa asked Van Rybrook in his seminal 2010 book on the Congo, how long is this independence of ours going to last anyway? When are the Belgians coming back? That's the basis. His 3 ideas is colonialism has some good parts. We should encourage that in some certain cases, and ultimately maybe think about, starting some new colony, having some people who just choose to live under the authority and the system of other Western, nations, sort of thing. And then the article continues. The case for the past record of Western colonialism, usually referring to British, French, German, Belgian, Dutch, and Portuguese colonies from the early 19th to mid-20th centuries, rests on overturning 2 distinct lines of criticism. That it was objectively harmful rather than beneficial, and that it was objectively illegitimate rather than legitimate. There is, in addition, a 3rd line of criticism that merits revision, that it offends the sensibilities of contemporary society. The objective cost-benefit approach identifies a certain need of human flourishing, development, security, governance, rights, etc., and asks whether colonialism improved or worsened the objective provision of that need. One main challenge of this research is to properly enumerate the things that matter and then assign them weights, which presumably vary with time and place. In a brutally patriarchal society, for instance, access to justice for women may have been more important than the protection of indigenous land rights, which may be part of that patriarchy. As Andreski argued, was the case for women in northern Nigeria under colonialism. A second challenge is measuring the counterfactual. What would likely have happened in a given place absent colonial rule? Many research designs, for instance, control for variations in colonial rule itself for a variety of other factors that coexist with colonialism, such as cultural norms, geography, population, disease burden, etc. But they do not control for the presence or absence of colonialism, for instance in a highly cited study by Asamoglu and colleagues, which he cites here. And then we get down to, I think this bit is kind of where the rubber kind of meets the road a little bit. It says here, noting some of these complexities, Abernathy summarizes the objective cost-benefit question as follows. In times and places where colonial rule had, on balance, a positive effect on training for self-government, material well-being, labor allocation choices, individual upward mobility, cross-cultural communication, and human dignity compared to the situation that would likely have obtained absent European rule, then the case for colonialism is strong. Conversely, in times and places where the effects of foreign rule in these respects were on balance negative compared to a territory's likely alternative past, then colonialism is morally indefensible. Beyond these requirements, there's a list of simple epistemic virtues, non-biased data, and case selection. For instance, that requires that evidence be gathered in a way that does not confirm the hypothesis at stake. Any claim about, say, the level of colonial violence requires not just assumptions about the scale of violence that would have occurred absent colonial rule, but also a careful measure of that violence relative to the population, security threat, and security resources in a given territory. One is hard-pressed to take a prominent example to find such care and measurement of the vast critical scholarship of the British counterinsurgency campaign against the Mao in Kenya from 1952 to 1960, especially in the scolding work of Elkins. Daniels argues that had the British left Kenya to the Mao, there would have been anarchy and further civil war, perhaps even genocide. Just as many Kenyans joined the Kikuyu Home Guard and the Special Prison Service for the rebels as joined the insurgency, and the independent Kenyan government has long applauded the historic contribution of the British in suppressing the movement. At the very least, it is incumbent on scholars to show that the brutalities unleashed by the British in this campaign were not likely the result of proportionate response given the context and scale of the threat. If this supposedly solid case is wobbly, what does it tell us about the lesser violence often cited as invalidating colonialism? Now, this is all about to get very highbrow and very academic, but I do love this paragraph here. The failure of anti-colonial critique to come to terms with the objective benefits and subjective legitimacy of colonialism points to a third and deeper failure. It was never meant to be true in the sense of being a scientific claim justified through shared standards of inquiry that was liable to falsification. The origins of anti-colonial thought were political and ideological. The purpose was not historical accuracy, but contemporaneous advocacy. Today, activists associate decolonization or post-colonialism with all manner of radical social transformation, which unintentionally ties historic conclusions to present-day endeavors. Unmoored from historical fact, post-colonialism became what Williams called a metropolitan flaneur culture of attitude and performance whose recent achievements include an inquiry into the glories of sadomasochism among Third World women, and a burgeoning literature on the horrors of colonialism under countries that never had colonies. This third failure of anti-colonial critique is perhaps the most damaging, as it is not just an obstacle to historical truth, which in itself is a grave disservice, but even as a means of contemporary advocacy. It is self-wounding, for it essentially weaponizes the colonial past, as the gradually imploding post-colonial South African state's persecution of Helen Zille shows. Quote, what a meta-narrative of anti-colonial sentiment can render invisible are ways in which people made claims on new possibilities without deploying either anti- or pro-colonial idioms. Egeland writes in a study of colonial-era newspapers in Zambia, quote, to devote all scholarly attention to the question of how different actors during this period sought to end colonial rule is to succumb in a limiting meta-narrative of all anti-colonialism, one that allows no conceptual space between colonial and anti-colonial agendas, and thereby keeps other possibilities inaccessible to the scholarly and moral imagination. And then he gets into the costs of anti-colonialism and, is the suffering greater or less for European and / sometimes American involvement or not? And then he begins to make his argument for resurrecting the colonial governance. It says here, reclaiming this colonial trajectory, abandoned at independence, is key to the colonial governance agenda. No less an anti-colonial hero than Chinua Achebe ended his days with a memoir that explicitly affirmed the positive contributions of colonialism to governance in his native Nigeria. Quote, it is important to face the fact that the British colonies were more or less expertly run, unquote, he wrote. What was important about Achebe's articulation of the unsayable, as Miscus called it, was his rediscovery of, quote, the colonial national formation as a habitable community, unquote. This had concrete implications for how to organize the civil service, how to manage federalism, and how to promote education. As with democratic episodes in a country's past, colonial episodes become an addict to ransack in search of a livable past. This also underscores the importance of reinvesting in a non-biased historiography of colonialism, so that the colonial periods are seen not as objects of resistance, but as fruitful sources of creativity. Secondly, and related, the colonial governance agenda recognizes that the capacity for effective self-government is lacking and cannot be conjured out of thin air. The lack of state capacity to uphold the rule of law and deliver public services was the central tragedy of the independence of the Third World, as a few voices like Plamonnetz and Barnes warned at the time. To reclaim, quote, colonial governance, unquote, means increasing foreign involvement in key sectors in business, civil society, and the public sector in order to bolster this capacity. In 1985, for instance, the Indonesian government fired all 6,000 government inspectors at the Jakarta port of Tanjung Priok and replaced the corrupt and inefficient customs service with the Swiss firm SGS. The Swiss rebuilt the customs service, handing back partial control in 1991 and full control in 1997. Indonesia's exports boomed. Civil society and successful policy reforms, meanwhile, improved faster with the presence of international civil society actors as they did in the colonial era, as shown by studies of environmental civil society. Multinational corporations, moreover, can be tasked with public service provision near their facilities in direct imitation of colonial practices, as Harnker has documented. The colonial governance agenda embraces cosmopolitanism, a civilizing mission, often lacking on the good governance agenda. Bain, for instance, admits, quote, the grim reality, unquote, and, quote, ghastly consequences, unquote, of decolonization. Yet he simultaneously rejects the idea that the West has anything to offer, since this implies an imperial mission. This uncritical critique of the liberal peace, as Chancellor calls it, consigns third world nations as foibles and vagaries of authentic or indigenous practices, a de facto abandonment of their hope of self-governing capacities. By contrast, the colonial governance agenda resurrects universalism of the liberal peace, and with it a shared standard of what a well-governed country looks like. So, like I said, this article goes on. I want to dash down to the end, and then we'll discuss a little bit and do the critique. I want to, here we are. So, and he gets into the new colonies thing at the end. I can't find it, but it's fine. The main point of this, the main thrust of this is that, well, there's a couple problems here. Let's start from the beginning. So, one, you have the situation of, what does decolonization mean? What does anti-colonialism mean? These, as he mentions, were things that were started as political and ideological works and processes in the 60s and 70s, whose job, let's never forget, their job was meant to rediscuss, reformulate, and rework with what life for people in countries that had lived under European rule for 150 years could look like and could be like. And let's also not forget that these colonial projects, I mean, and if you want to go into colonial projects in the New World, we can go back to the 1500s, but let's also forget that European colonialism oftentimes interrupts the cultural progress of a people, a nation, a country, a tribe, a group. And I think one of the aspects of this case for colonialism is the presumption that every human wants to live in a Western-style country, wants to live in a country run in a Western style that is stable, is democratic, has, law, rule of law, all this sort of thing. These very Western principles. I think that you have that sort of idea of wanting to impose that upon people, and that it should be imposed. I mean, there's a presumption that it should be imposed. The anti-colonial and decolonialist movement takes issue with that. Their whole idea was, no, these countries need to go, and we need to return to the first principles of our cultures as they were before colonialism came in, to understand a different relationship with each other, with nature, all this type of thing. Now, someone is going to come back and say, well, yeah, as Carnegie remarked in the 19th century, for most of human history, human lives were brutish and short. And, does anyone today really want to live brutish, short lives in a tribal environment where food is hard to come by, one good crop failure can wipe out a whole village, and you are subject not to a rule of law, but rule at the tip of a spear or a gun? And many would say, and a lot of people would say, no, don't want to go back to that. And I don't necessarily think that decolonization argues that, but I think decolonization also realizes that colonialization presumes there's only one way to do things, and it is the Western way, and completely disregards the wisdom and knowledge that exists in indigenous communities. And also this idea of quote unquote successful self-governance. We're talking about successful self-governance in the context of a Western dominated globalized economy. It's not like these people didn't know how to run themselves before the Europeans showed up. They did. Now, was it violent in many cases? Yes. Was it disadvantageous to women? Also, yes. And we've read a bit about, how patriarchal systems can disadvantage women. All this sort of thing. Are these, noble Western values to pass on to other people? Yes, absolutely. Are they necessarily in a cultural place where they can accept that, understand it, and conform themselves to it? That's maybe not, and as I kind of, look at different, cultures, it's like, well, you haven't had the Renaissance or the Enlightenment. And it shows, sort of thing. I mean, these are difficult discussions to have from an anthropological perspective. I think especially in Black and brown communities, there is a richness of wisdom, of religion, of relationship to land, community, nature that's very different than the relationship the West has to those things. And I think a lot of people wanting to reject what they see is an outside force coming in on them to take advantage of them resource-wise, economically, all this sort of thing. That's kind of where that stems from. And wanting to recall to an earlier time when at least in maybe your area or your country, your culture was the dominant culture, no matter how awful it was. And I think the decolonization anti-colonial crowd doesn't necessarily presume that it was better, but it will be better because it's yours. And it's not something implemented from outside onto you, forcing people to live in a certain way. And let's also not forget, colonialism was an imperialist project, but it was also primarily an economic project. The British show up in India because of the British East India Company. There was the resource extraction from the rest of the world to Europe and later to the United States is a very important aspect of the entire colonial project. A lot of the wealth and resources and was exists because of colonialism. Would Europe be Europe without colonialism? Probably not. Would the West be so fabulously wealthy and have such a high standard of living without exploitation of Africa or the South America or Asia? Probably not. Now, I do think, and this kind of to this guy's point, I do think the end of the colonial project in the 20th century was hasty, poorly planned, and caused a lot of unnecessary violence. We read about the Mao in Kenya. You can also talk about the Malay Emergency, which ended in 1961, which was communists trying to install communism in Malaysia, which the British undid and stopped. You can also talk about the war in Vietnam, which started as a French colonial project. It's always been a joke in political science circles that if one is going to be a former colony, it is better to be a British a former British colony than a French, a Spanish, or a Dutch. The British did a much better job of setting up the structures for self-governance than the French or the Dutch or the Spanish did. And obviously there's some outstanding cases of that, like Singapore, Malaysia, South Africa to some marginal degree, even the United States to some greater or lesser degree, Belize as well, as opposed to some of the difficulties that Latin America's had as former colonies, or some of the difficulties that have been had in Asia. So there's kind of multiple something to think about there as well. But I do think the idea of changing our relationship to each other, to nature, to society, and embracing the wisdom of indigenous people and cultures, not in a noble savagery, but in a real applicable way, and going back to first principles is an important aspect. And I think this case for colonialism really presumes upon creating a world that is, as he puts it, safe for peace, safe for liberty, but that is steeped firmly in the Western tradition, to the denigration of other traditions that maybe just didn't have enough time to grow or had reached their zenith, sort of thing. With all of that in mind, sort of thing, as I said at the beginning of this video, this was a very controversial article at the time. Actually, the link I had for it actually didn't work. I had to go re-find it again here at the National Association of Scholars. And so I want to read some of the criticisms, because it will get into some of the stuff that we've been talking about. So this is the author Bruce Gilley writing. On September 8, 2017, the Third World Quarterly published my article, quote, "The Case for Colonialism," through its online platform in anticipation of its inclusion in a hard copy edition at a later date. Within minutes of its appearance, a great controversy arose on social media. Over the ensuing weeks, half the journal's editorial board resigned in protest, and the editorial staff in London received credible death threats. On September 21st, I assented to the withdrawal of the article in the interest of the physical safety of the journal's editorial staff. The article was reprinted in 2018 in Academic Questions, the Journal of the National Association of Scholars, where it is the most read article in the journal's 34-year history. The article has its origins in 2012, when I stumbled upon the final book of Chinua Achebe while at an academic conference. Achebe's many positive comments on colonialism led me to delve deeper into the legacy of the supposedly anti-colonial figure, resulting in an article which I later published in African Affairs. It was while researching Achebe that I discovered the works of British colonial official Sir Alan Burns, which led me to write a biography of him, which was published in 2021. I wrote The Case for Colonialism in order to frame the positive case that Burns made within a more general theory and body of evidence. I submitted the article first to the Journal of Intervention and State Building. The editor there, Nicolas Lemay-Hebert, gave it desk approval and asked me to strengthen the policy-relevant aspects of the paper prior to sending it over for peer review. The paper then received one positive and one negative review. Lemay-Hebert then asked his editorial board whether he should publish the paper, and was told that it was too politically controversial to publish. The, quote, fear of the political backlash, unquote, determined the decision not to accept it. He wrote to me by email. I next turned to the Third World Quarterly, in which I had previously published 2 peer-reviewed articles, one of which took a clearly pro-colonial standpoint. I first submitted it to a planned special issue on, quote, the new imperialism. The special issue editors immediately rejected it because it took a positive rather than a negative view of their chosen topic, even though their call for papers not indicated that a particular normative perspective was required of submissions. The, quote, range of theoretical and imperial viewpoints, unquote, that they had in mind, as they later explained, was limited to Marxism, post-colonialism, black Marxism, Pan-Africanism, and, quote, the revolutionary theory of Frantz Fanon and Che Guevara, unquote. After I failed to win consideration for inclusion in the special issue, the Third World Quarterly editor Shahid Kadir sent my article for normal peer review. It received one positive and one negative review. Kadir, as was his prerogative, decided to run it, but as a viewpoint rather than a research article with my consent. In the subsequent years, the article has been the subject of countless essays, conference panels, seminar discussions, and journal articles. It has over 130 citations in Google Scholar at this writing. It is the 9th most read article in Third World Quarterly's 42-year history, even though readers can read only the withdrawal notice. Oddly, the Third World Quarterly has begun to allow authors to cite the original withdrawn article, albeit only critically and in a way that directs readers to the withdrawal notice rather than to the published version in Academic Questions. For example, in Fasikin's recent article continuing the long tradition of blaming colonialism for Africa's contemporary woes. After a lifetime of writing as a journalist and academic, those 8,000 words have come to identify me and to dominate my time in a way that I could have never imagined. I have waited several years to respond to critics of the article, mainly in order to allow the dust to settle and for the best critiques to be lodged. Here I will address only what I consider to be serious scholarly responses. This means I am not responding to the outpouring of emotionally charged attacks on the article by reputable scholars, of which there are dozens, but they are a reminder of what I believe is the fundamentally ideological rather than scientific basis of my critics. I find that my critics mostly misread my article, used citations they had not read or understood, failed to adhere to the basic social scientific principles, and imposed their own interpretations on data without knowing the possibility of alternatives. I note that a failure to adhere to academic standards. The main charge leveled against my paper is rife among those who have leveled such charges. The use of their critiques to impose professional penalties and punishments on me as a scholar bespeaks the fundamental problems of ideological monoculture and illiberal censorship in academia today. I conclude that the problems of most research on the colonial past since roughly 1960 are so deep-rooted that nothing short of a complete rewriting of colonial history under appropriate scientific conditions will suffice in most cases. This was where he gets into King Leopold's ghost. This is good. Klein, like others, cites the American journalist Adam Hochschild's 1998 book, King Leopold's Ghost, while carrying the subtitle A Story of Greed, Terror, and Heroism in Colonial Africa. Hochschild acknowledged that the control of the private plantation, quote, was shared in no way with the Belgian government, unquote. This was the same conclusion reached by an investigating magistrate at the time who wrote, the state of Congo is no colonized state, but barely a state at all, but a financial enterprise. The Belgian Congo was never under Leopold's rule, and the 52 years of this colony from 1908 to 1960 were the only period of good governance that this benighted region has ever known. This is not a technicality, quite the opposite. King Leopold's private estates in the Congo were precisely the counterfactual to colonial rule, and the best argument for colonialism. His inability to control his native rubber agents, who continued their pre-colonial business of slave trading and coercive rubber harvesting, showed the problems that would arise if European freelancers allied with native warlords and slave traders and established regimes with little to no outside scrutiny. The proposition that there was some feasible good governance model available in this region from indigenous supported sources is unsupported. The Batamba Afro-Arab slave traders of the area. This is an odd thing. The Batamba Afro-Arab slave traders of the area, the African warlord Masiri, whose compound decorated with human remains, was the inspiration, along with a similar compound of the King of Benin, for Conrad's Heart of Darkness, transposed onto a white trader to elicit the predictable outrage from the white readers. The feared Arab slavers Tipo Tip, or Al-Zubair, Belgian colonization of the Congo in 1908, put an end to independence for the Congo, and thank goodness for that. In making this small mistake, my critics open us to a wider world of their misunderstanding of colonial history. And so it goes on. I mean, the response is almost as long as the article. The economics part is very interesting. It says here, more specifically, critics should simply refer to the mountain of evidence from serious economists showing the erroneous nature of both Rodney's specific claims about Africa, as shown in many regression studies beginning with the work of Greer, as well as the more general claim, first with respect to the granddaddy of them all, India, as shown repeatedly by the work of the acknowledged expert on that topic, Turankar Roy, and to the colonial world taken as a whole, as demonstrated by one study using islands as natural experiments. Taylor writes, not only should we not accept Gillies' general pro-colonial explanation of the poor performance of many post-colonial African nations, since he provides us with no good reason to do so, we do have a good reason to believe that their poor performance is a legacy of their colonial subjection. Actually, we do not. If colonial subjugation caused poor performance, then today's Ethiopia would be the economic miracle of Africa. Instead, the only semi-successful African economy ever was South Africa until its system of white minority rule was hastily decolonized in the early 1990s, and the country went into a tailspin. I agree with Osterkamp that the long-form essay by Heldrick and Robinson measures up well to the highest standards of scientific inquiry in reaching the conclusion that colonialism's overall effect on development in Africa was negative. Though mainly a literature review and an interpretive foray, it provides a rigorous and logical counter-argument to claims about colonialism's positive impact on development. Although anti-colonial narratives have less traction in Asia because of the success of its former colonies, recent work that affirms the positive contributions of colonialism in Asia as well includes a recent study by Dell and Olken about Dutch sugar production in Java, which is Indonesia, which concludes the establishment of sugar processing infrastructure in colonial Java persistently increased industrialization, education, and household consumption in areas near government sugar factories, even after the factories themselves had disappeared. Similarly, villages forced to grow sugarcane for the cultivation system have more schooling and manufacturing today. The positive impacts of economic activity plausibly dominated any negative effects in the long run. Ken Tammer writes that while some studies find that former British colonies have performed better economically and politically than others, virtually none find that colonial rule itself was an effective method of setting up long-term prosperity and stability. While citing Greer incorrectly, his study makes a general claim about longer colonial rule in addition to the specific one about British rule. The virtually none citation is to Lang, and Ken Tammer might have added the subsequent book on the subject. Several points are in order. First, let us agree that Ling's work is top-rate and scientific. Second, let us agree that the other work is top-rate and scientific reaches other conclusions. Third, if one were to pin such a sweeping statement about virtually none showing any positive effect to Ling's work, one would want to read it carefully. Ling's work looks only at variations within British colonialism. It has nothing to say about comparative colonialism, much less colonialism versus non-colonialism, since the analysis is limited to former British colonies. Further investigation is necessary if one attempts to generalize outside of the cases analyzed here. Nor does it even consider the role of post-colonial policies in explaining contemporary conditions, a rather glaring omission. Moreover, his theory does not work for India, which, depending on how you measure it, accounted for about 75% of British colonialism. Nor does it work for Botswana or Guyana, 2 of the 4 cases he chooses in the book to illustrate the uncertainties of his argument. Finally, the statistical model really just shows that African countries were 6 times more likely to be ruled indirectly than others, and that such rule was associated with worse outcomes. Ling's work tells us nothing about colonialism. It does tell us about the challenges of development in Africa. And again, we're not going to go through the whole thing, and this little segment's getting a little bit long. We're about 35 minutes. I like to keep these kind of short, but I do want to say, what have we learned from all of this? This has been very heavy, very heady, very academic. What have we learned here? I'll tell you. Like so many things in life, the truth is oftentimes more complicated than the story and the narrative. And the narrative coming out of colonialization is that the Europeans showed up one day, they took over the place, took all the resources, took advantage of the people, exploited them, and then one day when it was convenient, left. And now these people have to run these countries on their own, but they're so far from their indigenous values and principles and ways of being that they're stuck in broken systems, and thanks to multinational corporations who are doing business, they're still stuck in a trap. And I wrote a paper on this in college. I called, when I referred to the modern globalized economy, I said it was the new colonialism, and I said it was the same colonialism under the same, it wasn't even under new management, it was colonialism under the same management. Only now, you just get to have a company go in and take advantage of the resources without actually having to run the place and deal with the social policy. Obviously, institutions like the World Bank and the IMF spend trillions financing different countries, regimes, development projects, all this sort of thing, and a lot of them are unsuccessful. Even China's having problems in Africa. And so I think that last bit, I think, is really key, that it is difficult to do development in Africa. These are very difficult geographies. Africa does not have, I think the Nile is the only it has no east-west navigable rivers, just north-south, and it's only the Nile. Notice most of the developments up there. Sub-Saharan Africa doesn't have an east-west navigable river. They don't have a lot of ports or harbors. Africa actually has the shortest coastline. Most of the land area is interior. So there's some structural challenges. There's also cultural challenges. We have to remember that a lot of the people who live there now are descendants of people who, until about 200 years ago, were living essentially Stone Age, maybe Bronze Age lifestyles. This was the same thing true of Aztecs and Incas in the Americas with the arrival of Spain and France, or even Plains tribes, the arrival of Americans in the 19th century. And so there is this sort of, I think, displacement that is an aspect of colonialism that I think decolonialism tries to deconstruct. And I think the struggle is how to have people function in a modern globalized society dominated by Western values and governance when that's not their people, that's not their culture, that's not where they came from, and that's not how they do things, and they relate to the world in a completely different manner. I think there's a paternalistic aspect to colonialism that we've also seen in chattel slavery in the New World. That's an aspect of it. And I'm not a hard decolonial person or post-colonial person. I'm just understanding narratives. And the whole point of this video is to say we have to question our narratives. What do I always say? The news is a narrative. That's why they call it a story. I'm questioning. It's important for us to question what we think we know about colonialism and question Why do we think it's bad? Do we have a well reason for that? And I think one of the things that's great about this article is he does a great job of making us really think, what is our actual problem with colonialism? What is the real issue? And can it be used for good to raise the lives and living standards of people now? I think is a fascinating concept. I think to understand the challenges of development, of foreign rule, all this type of thing is absolutely fascinating. And perhaps, as shocking as it might be, against the dominant liberal narrative about colonialism, that some places and some people would rather be ruled by someone else who knows how to do stuff and knows how to make life good for them, regardless. And the local ordinary leaders cannot really be relied upon, especially given that they're easily bribed by foreign corporations for exploitation, all this sort of thing, and that having a strong rule of law and strong civil service and strong institutions and all this type of thing could create conditions for much more success down the road. Obviously, one wants to reduce the violence nature of it, and one wants to be fair in the prosecution of crimes and antisocial behavior and all this sort of thing. But it is, and I think the aspects of colonialism that look down on the colonized as lesser humans obviously wouldn't really be part of the conversation now. But again, we're challenging this narrative about colonialism. What really is the problem? Are we wrong about this? And that's what Gilly challenges us to think about. So what I want you to take away from this video and this podcast is to think about these things at a deep level and to understand that just because you've been told something is always bad does not necessarily mean it is. Now, sometimes it is. Things are bad because they're bad. Shocking. But other times, that may not necessarily be the whole story. So we have to question the narrative. We have to think about these things critically and decide for ourselves. And if there's one thing I've always asked my listeners to do, it's exactly that. So thank you for listening to this edition of the Cameron Journal podcast, The Case for Colonialism. My name is Cameron Cowan. Thank you so much for watching and or listening. You can find me online. All my links are at CameronJournal.com. Thank you so much.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you.